In 1839, deep in the humid swamplands of Jefferson County, Florida, plantation records suddenly went silent about the Blackwood estate. What began as routine documentation of cotton yields and slave inventories ended abruptly that autumn, leaving only scattered fragments of correspondence that would remain buried in courthouse basements for over 180 years. The silence wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated to hide one of the most disturbing breeding programs ever documented in the antebellum South. Master Jonathan Blackwood had turned his plantation into something far more sinister than a cotton operation. With his wife Elizabeth unable to bear children, Blackwood implemented a systematic breeding program that violated every boundary of human decency. But Elizabeth wasn't merely a bystander to her husband's cruelty. She was forced to witness it, to oversee it, and to live with the psychological torment of watching her husband's grotesque attempt to build a dynasty through the bodies of enslaved women. The truth about Blackwood Plantation would remain buried until 2019, when restoration workers renovating the old Jefferson County courthouse discovered a hidden compartment containing letters, medical records, and accounting ledgers that painted a picture so disturbing that local historians initially questioned their authenticity. These documents revealed not just the mechanics of forced breeding, but the psychological warfare inflicted upon both the enslaved and Blackwood's own wife, a woman trapped in a marriage that had become a living nightmare. What emerged from those dusty papers was the story of a man whose obsession with creating a perfect enslaved workforce led him to commit acts that horrified even his contemporaries. And it was the story of the women, both free and enslaved, who suffered under his twisted vision of domestic and economic control. Chapter 1. The Master's Obsession. 43 years ago, in a plantation isolated deep in Jefferson County, Florida, courthouse records and local testimonies mentioned a case so disturbing that it was quickly buried in silence. Jonathan Blackwood disappeared from official records, but not from the traumatic memories of the surrounding community. His absence left deep scars, marking generations with a horror that only now begins to be revealed. Before continuing, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Jonathan Blackwood arrived in Florida Territory in 1835 with ambitious plans and dark intentions. Unlike other planters who came seeking agricultural prosperity, Blackwood's vision was fundamentally different. He had purchased 2,800 acres of fertile land along the Orcilla River, but his real interest wasn't in growing cotton, it was in growing people. The first disturbing signs appeared in his correspondence with slave dealers from Virginia and South Carolina. Rather than requesting field hands or domestic servants, Blackwood's letters specified exact physical requirements: women between ages 16 and 25, men of exceptional size and strength, all to be of proven fertile stock. Local slave traders later testified that Blackwood paid premium prices, sometimes double the market rate, for enslaved people who met his specific breeding criteria. His wife Elizabeth had suffered 3 miscarriages in their 6 years of marriage. Contemporary medical records, discovered in the hidden courthouse cache, reveal that a Charleston physician had declared her barren of womb in 1837. For most men of the era, this would have been a private tragedy. For Blackwood, it became the catalyst for an obsession that would consume his plantation and terrorize everyone within its boundaries. By 1838, Blackwood had assembled what he called his breeding stock, 43 enslaved individuals specifically selected for reproductive purposes. His meticulously kept ledgers, written in his own hand, detailed measurements, health assessments, and predicted breeding schedules with the cold precision of a livestock operation. But these weren't cattle or horses. These were human beings whose lives he intended to control in the most intimate and degrading ways possible. The plantation's layout reflected Blackwood's twisted priorities. While most plantations segregated unmarried enslaved people, Blackwood constructed special quarters designed to facilitate his breeding program. These buildings, described in contemporary accounts as breeding barracks, contained small, windowless rooms where his chosen breeders were confined with selected women. What made Blackwood's operation particularly cruel was the psychological torment he inflicted upon his wife. Elizabeth was not merely aware of her husband's breeding program, she was forced to participate in it. Letters found in her personal effects, written but never sent to her sister in Georgia, described being compelled to witness and even oversee the forced unions that her husband orchestrated. The first recorded breeding session took place in November 1838. Blackwood's journals describe it with horrifying clinical detachment, noting the women's resistance and his methods of ensuring compliance. He documented everything: the timing, the participants, the physical arrangements, and most disturbingly, his wife's reactions to witnessing what he considered his solution to their childless marriage. By the winter of 1838, news of Blackwood's activities began spreading through Florida's planter society. Unlike the informal breeding practices that occurred on many plantations, Blackwood's systematic approach shocked even his pro-slavery contemporaries. Local church leaders received anonymous complaints, and several neighboring planters expressed their disgust in private correspondence. The enslaved community on Blackwood Plantation lived in constant terror. Beyond the physical violations, they endured the psychological warfare of never knowing who would be selected next, who would be forced into unions against their will, or which children might be sold away to serve Blackwood's expanding operation. Some attempted escape, fleeing toward the Everglades, where Seminoles offered protection, but Blackwood's pursuit of runaways was relentless and brutal. As 1839 began, Blackwood's breeding program was producing results that satisfied his twisted ambitions. Several enslaved women were pregnant, and his ledgers proudly calculated the projected value of their future offspring. But the psychological cost was mounting, not just among the enslaved, but within his own household, where his wife Elizabeth was showing signs of severe mental distress from the horrors she was forced to witness daily. Chapter 2. The breeding barracks. The physical infrastructure of Blackwood's breeding program revealed the calculated nature of his cruelty. Archaeological evidence uncovered during the 2019 courthouse renovations included detailed architectural plans that Blackwood himself had drawn for what he euphemistically called his propagation facilities. These buildings stood apart from the regular slave quarters, positioned where Elizabeth could observe them from the main house's second-floor windows. Blackwood had deliberately placed them within his wife's constant view, ensuring she could never escape the reality of what he was orchestrating. The buildings contained 12 small rooms, each measuring only 8 by 10 feet, with heavy wooden doors that locked from the outside. Contemporary accounts from neighboring plantations described the sounds that emanated from these buildings: screams, sobbing, and pleas for mercy that could be heard across the plantation grounds. Sarah McKinnon, wife of a nearby planter, wrote to her sister in Tallahassee, describing sleepless nights disturbed by the most pitiful human cries coming from the Blackwood property. Blackwood's methods were systematic and brutal. His journals detailed how he would select pairings based on physical characteristics he wished to replicate in offspring. Tall, strong men were forced with women he deemed good breeders, those who had already borne children or showed signs of fertility. He kept detailed records of menstrual cycles, tracking the optimal times for forced breeding sessions. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the enslaved community to his own wife. Elizabeth's letters describe being summoned to witness these forced unions, ostensibly to learn about proper breeding techniques. Blackwood convinced her that watching would help her understand why she had failed to conceive, inflicting a double cruelty that destroyed her mentally while serving his desire for control. Medical records found in the cache reveal that Blackwood had consulted with several physicians about his breeding program. Dr. Marcus Whitfield of Monticello provided him with literature on animal husbandry techniques, which Blackwood adapted for use on human beings. The correspondence between them discusses improving stock and selective breeding for desired traits, with the same language used for livestock. The enslaved community developed their own forms of resistance. Women attempted to induce miscarriages using traditional remedies, while men tried to protect the women by intervening during forced breeding sessions, often resulting in severe punishments. Some couples formed protective bonds, with men attempting to claim specific women as wives to prevent them from being selected for Blackwood's program. Blackwood's ledgers reveal his frustration when these resistance efforts succeeded. He recorded failed pregnancies, noting sabotage by breeding stock and implementing punishments designed to break the community's solidarity. These punishments included public whippings, separation of families, and the threat of sale to even crueler masters. The breeding barracks became a source of psychological terror for everyone on the plantation. Even children understood their sinister purpose, and mothers lived in constant fear that their daughters would eventually be selected for the program. Boys faced the terror of potentially being chosen as breeders, forced to violate women they might consider sisters or mothers. Elizabeth's mental deterioration accelerated as she was forced to participate more directly in the program. Her letters describe being required to examine women for signs of pregnancy, to maintain breeding schedules, and to report any resistance or sabotage to her husband. The role turned her from victim into unwilling accomplice, a transformation that haunted her for the rest of her life. By spring 1839, the breeding program had produced its first pregnancies. Blackwood's journals show his satisfaction with the results, calculating the monetary value of expected offspring and planning expansion of his operation. He corresponded with other planters about sharing breeding services, treating human beings like livestock available for stud fees. The success of his program emboldened Blackwood to document his methods more extensively. He began writing what he called a manual for scientific breeding, intending to share his techniques with other planters. This manual, discovered in 2019, provides the most detailed and disturbing account of systematic forced breeding ever found in American slavery records. Chapter 3. The Silent Wife. Elizabeth Blackwood's descent into psychological torment paralleled the expansion of her husband's breeding program. Her personal correspondence, hidden for decades in a trunk discovered during courthouse renovations, reveals a woman slowly losing her sanity under the weight of enforced complicity in acts she found morally repugnant. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Born Elizabeth Chandler in Savannah, Georgia, she had married Jonathan Blackwood in 1832, believing him to be a successful merchant with plans to establish a respectable plantation in Florida Territory. Her letters to her sister reveal a woman of education and refinement who had initially been excited about building a new life in the frontier territory. The transformation began gradually. Elizabeth's first letter expressing concern was dated March 1838, 6 months after arriving at the plantation. She wrote about her husband's unusual interest in the personal affairs of our Negroes and his strange conversations about improving our stock through selective breeding. At this point, she still believed his interests were purely agricultural. By summer 1838, Elizabeth's letters showed growing alarm. She described her husband's construction of the separate quarters and his increasingly detailed questions about her own reproductive history. Blackwood had begun blaming her for their childlessness, suggesting that her failure as a wife necessitated alternative methods of building their family legacy. The first forced breeding session that Elizabeth was compelled to witness occurred in November 1838. Her letter to her sister, written the next day but never sent, described the event as the most hellish spectacle imaginable. She wrote about screaming that lasted through the night and her husband's cold satisfaction at what he called the beginning of our dynasty. Blackwood's psychological manipulation of his wife was systematic and cruel. He convinced Elizabeth that her presence during breeding sessions was necessary for her to understand the natural processes she had failed to achieve. He told her that watching would help her learn what she was doing wrong, turning her reproductive failures into justification for forcing her to witness rape. Contemporary medical records show that Elizabeth began suffering from what physicians of the era called nervous exhaustion. Dr. Samuel Morrison of Tallahassee visited the plantation several times in early 1839, prescribing laudanum for Elizabeth's hysterical episodes and documenting symptoms that modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe trauma. Elizabeth's role in the breeding program evolved from unwilling witness to active participant. Her husband required her to maintain breeding schedules, track women's menstrual cycles, and report any signs of resistance or sabotage. She was forced to become the administrative overseer of a system that violated every principle she had been raised to believe. The psychological toll manifested in physical symptoms. Elizabeth's letters describe persistent nightmares, loss of appetite, and an inability to be alone with enslaved women without thinking about their suffering. She began avoiding certain areas of the plantation and developed what she called episodes of the shaking when forced to enter the breeding quarters. Her isolation was complete. Elizabeth couldn't discuss her situation with neighboring plantation wives without exposing her husband's activities and her own forced complicity. Her letters show increasing desperation as she realized she was trapped in a situation where seeking help would mean admitting to participating in acts that horrified even slavery's supporters. The arrival of the first babies born from forced breeding in summer 1839 pushed Elizabeth toward complete breakdown. Her journal entries from this period, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, describe her conflicted feelings about the children, innocent victims of her husband's cruelty, yet living reminders of the system she had been forced to help orchestrate. Blackwood's treatment of his wife grew more controlling as her mental state deteriorated. He began monitoring her correspondence, limiting her interactions with neighbors, and threatening to have her committed to an asylum if she revealed their family business to outsiders. Elizabeth became a prisoner in her own home, trapped by shame, fear, and her husband's manipulation. By autumn 1839, Elizabeth's letters show a woman on the verge of complete psychological collapse. She wrote about contemplating escape, suicide, or exposing her husband's crimes regardless of the consequences. Her final dated letter, written in October 1839, ends mid-sentence with the words, "I cannot bear witness to this evil any longer." Chapter 4. The Human Livestock. The enslaved community at Blackwood Plantation lived under a reign of terror that went far beyond typical plantation brutality. Blackwood's breeding program transformed human beings into commodities to be manipulated, violated, and bred like livestock, creating a psychological hell that affected every person within the plantation's boundaries. Blackwood's selection process for his breeding program was methodical and dehumanizing. He maintained detailed physical records of every enslaved person, noting height, weight, muscle development, and what he considered genetic strengths and weaknesses. Women were subjected to invasive medical examinations to determine fertility, while men were evaluated for size, strength, and what Blackwood termed breeding potential. The plantation's most tragic figure was a man known only as Big Jim, whom Blackwood had purchased specifically for breeding purposes. Contemporary accounts describe Jim as exceptionally tall and strong, but his letters to sympathetic neighbors reveal a man tormented by his forced role in violating women he considered family. Jim's resistance led to increasingly severe punishments, including public whippings designed to break his spirit. Women on the plantation faced the constant terror of selection for forced breeding. Blackwood maintained a rotation system, ensuring that fertile women were regularly subjected to forced unions with his chosen male breeders. The psychological trauma extended beyond the immediate victims to their families, who were forced to watch their loved ones violated as part of Blackwood's systematic program. The most heartbreaking accounts come from mothers who were forced to surrender their young daughters to the breeding program. Testimonies collected decades later describe women who never recovered from watching their children become victims of Blackwood's systematic sexual violence. Some attempted to hide their daughters' maturity, while others tried to arrange marriages within the community to provide protection. Blackwood's records reveal his frustration with what he called breeding resistance. The enslaved community developed various forms of sabotage, including the use of traditional medicines to prevent pregnancy and the formation of protective relationships to shield vulnerable women. These acts of resistance were met with brutal punishments designed to break community solidarity. The psychological warfare extended to the children born from forced breeding. Blackwood viewed these children as valuable property, but also as proof of his program's success. He kept detailed records of their development, noting which pairings produced the strongest offspring and adjusting his breeding strategies accordingly. Medical records from the period show that several enslaved women suffered severe physical and psychological trauma from their participation in the breeding program. Dr. Whitfield's correspondence with Blackwood reveals discussions about treating women who had been injured during forced breeding sessions, with the doctor's primary concern being preserving their future breeding capacity rather than their well-being. The community's attempts at resistance took many forms. Some enslaved people attempted escape, fleeing toward Seminole territories where they might find protection. Others turned to sabotage, destroying crops or damaging equipment to express their resistance to Blackwood's system. These acts of defiance were met with increasingly severe punishments. The most tragic form of resistance involved attempts to protect children from the breeding program. Parents would sometimes attempt to hide their children's ages or claim they were too sick to be suitable for breeding. Some families even attempted to arrange marriages between very young children to prevent them from being selected for Blackwood's program. Blackwood's ledgers show his view of enslaved people as nothing more than breeding stock to be managed for maximum productivity. His entries compare human breeding cycles to those of livestock, noting optimal timing for forced breeding sessions and calculating expected returns on his breeding investments. The dehumanization was complete and systematic. The psychological impact on the entire enslaved community cannot be overstated. Even those not directly involved in the breeding program lived in constant fear of selection. The terror created an atmosphere of helplessness and despair that affected every aspect of life on the plantation, from work productivity to family relationships. Contemporary observers noted the unusual atmosphere at Blackwood Plantation. Neighboring planters commented on the silence that pervaded the property and the visible fear displayed by enslaved people when visitors arrived. The breeding program had created a level of terror that was unusual even by the standards of antebellum slavery. Chapter 5. The Network of Silence. The conspiracy to hide Blackwood's breeding program extended far beyond the plantation boundaries, involving local officials, neighboring planters, and even religious leaders who chose silence over intervention. This network of complicity ensured that the horrors at Blackwood Plantation remained hidden from outside scrutiny and official records. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell of Jefferson County received at least 3 formal complaints about activities at Blackwood Plantation between 1838 and 1839, according to recently discovered correspondence. However, his responses show a pattern of dismissal and deflection, referring to the complaints as domestic discipline matters outside his jurisdiction. Caldwell's personal financial records show regular payments from Blackwood, suggesting a corrupt relationship that brought silence. The local church played a particularly disturbing role in the cover-up. Reverend Samuel Price of Monticello Methodist Church received detailed accounts of Blackwood's breeding program from several sources, including anonymous letters describing the forced breeding sessions and Elizabeth's psychological deterioration. His response was to counsel patience and prayer, while taking no concrete action to intervene. Neighboring planters formed an informal network of silence around Blackwood's activities. While many privately expressed disgust at his methods, they feared that public exposure would invite unwanted scrutiny of their own plantation practices. Their correspondence reveals a consensus that plantation discipline should remain a private matter, regardless of its extremity. Dr. Marcus Whitfield's involvement went beyond providing medical consultation for the breeding program. His letters reveal that he actively helped Blackwood refine his methods and even provided drugs to subdue resistant women during forced breeding sessions. Whitfield's medical license allowed him to purchase substances that Blackwood couldn't obtain directly, making him a crucial enabler of the program. The territorial government's response to rumors about Blackwood Plantation was willful ignorance. Governor Robert Reed received reports about unusual activities at the plantation, but chose not to investigate, citing concerns about interfering with private property rights. His correspondence shows more concern about potential political ramifications than about the human rights violations occurring under his jurisdiction. Local merchants and suppliers also became complicit through their continued business relationships with Blackwood. Despite widespread knowledge of his activities, they continued providing supplies for the breeding quarters and even specialized equipment that Blackwood requested for his program. Their invoices, discovered in 2019, show purchases of restraints, medical supplies, and other items clearly intended for the breeding operation. The legal system's failure was systematic and deliberate. County Judge Harrison Polk dismissed several attempts by enslaved people and sympathetic whites to bring complaints against Blackwood. Polk's legal opinions consistently ruled that matters of slave discipline were beyond court jurisdiction, effectively placing Blackwood's activities above the law. Educational institutions also contributed to the silence. When rumors reached the Florida Territorial Seminary, later Florida State University, administrators chose not to investigate despite having connections to several county officials. Their correspondence shows concern about potential scandal, but no interest in addressing the underlying human rights violations. The conspiracy of silence was reinforced by economic interests. Blackwood's success in breeding enslaved people made his stock valuable throughout the region. Other planters quietly purchased children born from his breeding program, creating a market that incentivized continued operations. These economic relationships created stakeholders who benefited from maintaining silence. Some individuals did attempt to intervene, but faced systematic intimidation. Mary Patterson, a neighboring planter's wife who tried to help Elizabeth Blackwood, received threatening letters warning her to mind her own domestic affairs. Her husband eventually forbade her from visiting the Blackwood plantation, effectively isolating Elizabeth from potential support. The most disturbing aspect of the silence network was its premeditation. Correspondence between various officials shows discussions about how to handle potential exposure of Blackwood's activities. They developed strategies to discredit witnesses, suppress testimony, and redirect investigations, a coordinated effort to protect what they saw as property rights. Religious justification played a role in maintaining silence. Several ministers provided theological arguments supporting Blackwood's right to manage his property as he saw fit. Their sermons emphasized obedience to authority and acceptance of worldly suffering, providing religious cover for the systematic violation of human dignity. The network's effectiveness in maintaining silence lasted well beyond 1839. Official records from the period contain no mention of Blackwood's breeding program, despite extensive documentation of other plantation activities. This systematic erasure from the historical record ensured that the truth remained buried for over 180 years. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. By October 1839, the psychological and physical toll of Blackwood's breeding program had pushed everyone at the plantation toward breaking points that would culminate in a violent confrontation that ended the systematic horrors but began decades of cover-up. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps Big Jim's story reach more people. Elizabeth Blackwood's mental deterioration reached critical levels in early October 1839. Her personal diary, discovered during courthouse renovations, shows increasingly erratic entries describing hallucinations, violent dreams, and an obsession with ending her husband's breeding program. Her final coherent entry, dated October 15, 1839, describes planning to stop this evil by any means necessary. The enslaved community had also reached its limit. Big Jim, the man forced to serve as Blackwood's primary breeder, had become increasingly defiant despite severe punishments. Contemporary accounts describe him as barely recognizable from the strong man who had arrived at the plantation, his spirit broken by months of forced participation in acts he found morally repugnant. The catalyst for the final confrontation came when Blackwood selected a 13-year-old girl named Sarah for his breeding program. Her mother, Rebecca, had already lost 2 daughters to the program and faced the prospect of watching her youngest child suffer the same fate. Underground Railroad documents suggest that Rebecca had been planning escape but decided instead to fight back. On the night of October 18, 1839, multiple sources of resistance converged in a violent confrontation that would end Blackwood's breeding program forever. Elizabeth's diary suggests she had planned to poison her husband's dinner, while evidence points to a coordinated uprising among the enslaved community led by Big Jim and Rebecca. Contemporary accounts of that night are fragmentary and contradictory, but all agree on the violence of the confrontation. Neighboring planters reported hearing screams and seeing flames rising from the Blackwood plantation. Sheriff Caldwell's official report, filed weeks later, described finding the main house partially burned and Jonathan Blackwood dead from what was ruled a hunting accident. Elizabeth Blackwood's fate remains unclear from official records, but private correspondence suggests she survived the night's events only to suffer a complete mental breakdown. Dr. Morrison's final medical report describes treating her for severe trauma and recommending immediate commitment to an asylum. She disappears from all records after November 1839. Big Jim and several other enslaved people also disappeared that night. While official records suggest they fled during the chaos, some contemporary accounts hint at more violent conclusions. The truth about what happened to the primary victims and perpetrators of Blackwood's breeding program was buried along with the official investigation. The cleanup operation began immediately. Sheriff Caldwell arrived at the plantation 3 days later with a team of officials who systematically destroyed evidence of the breeding program. The special quarters were demolished, records were burned, and surviving enslaved people were quickly sold to planters in other states. The cover-up involved coordinated efforts by multiple officials to create an alternative narrative about the plantation's activities and the events of October 18. Official records describe a tragic hunting accident that claimed Jonathan Blackwood's life and forced the plantation's closure. No mention was made of the breeding program or the systematic violations that had occurred. Surviving enslaved people were scattered to prevent them from sharing their testimonies about Blackwood's breeding program. Many were sold to plantations in Louisiana and Texas, effectively exiling the witnesses to what had occurred at Blackwood Plantation. This dispersal was coordinated to ensure that no concentration of survivors could corroborate accounts of the breeding program. The official investigation was deliberately superficial. Sheriff Caldwell's report focused entirely on the physical evidence of fire and Jonathan Blackwood's death, making no mention of the breeding quarters, the systematic sexual violence, or the psychological torture that had characterized the plantation's operations. Church records from the period show coordinated efforts to suppress any discussion of the events at Blackwood Plantation. Ministers were instructed to discourage congregation members from speculating about the plantation's activities and to redirect discussions toward themes of acceptance and divine judgment. The conspiracy of silence that had protected Blackwood's breeding program during its operation proved equally effective in erasing evidence of its existence after its violent end. Within months, local records had been sanitized, witnesses dispersed, and alternative narratives established to replace the disturbing truth about what had occurred. Chapter 7. The Vanishing Records. The systematic destruction of evidence related to Blackwood Plantation began within hours of the violent events of October 18th, 1839, involving coordinated efforts by local officials, religious leaders, and neighboring planters to erase any trace of the breeding program from historical memory. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell's initial response to the plantation crisis focused not on investigating the crimes, but on containing potential scandal. His private correspondence, discovered in 2019, reveals instructions to deputies about removing sensitive materials from the plantation before conducting any official investigation. This evidence tampering ensured that the breeding program would leave no trace in official records. The document destruction was methodical and comprehensive. Blackwood's breeding ledgers, medical correspondence, architectural plans for the breeding quarters, and Elizabeth's personal diary were all supposed to be destroyed in the immediate aftermath. However, some materials survived due to the chaos of the October 18th events and hasty cleanup efforts. County Clerk William Harrison played a crucial role in sanitizing official records. His ledgers from late 1839 show extensive revisions to plantation registration documents, tax records, and court filings related to Blackwood Plantation. These revisions removed any reference to the specialized buildings or unusual population demographics that might hint at the breeding program. Church leaders coordinated their own destruction of evidence. Reverend Samuel Price burned several letters describing the breeding program and removed pages from church records that mentioned pastoral visits to traumatized enslaved people. His replacement of these records with sanitized versions ensured that religious archives contained no trace of the systematic violations. The legal system's role in evidence destruction was particularly thorough. Judge Harrison Polk ordered the destruction of several complaints filed against Blackwood, claiming they were unsubstantiated accusations against a deceased citizen. His court records from the period show systematic removal of any documentation that might reveal the extent of official complicity in ignoring the breeding program. Neighboring planters participated in the cover-up by destroying their own correspondence about Blackwood's activities. Private letters expressing disgust at the breeding program were burned, while sanitized versions were created to replace them in family archives. This coordinated destruction of private records eliminated potential evidence of contemporary knowledge about the program. Medical records posed a particular challenge for the cover-up. Dr. Marcus Whitfield had maintained detailed records of his consultations regarding the breeding program, including correspondence about techniques and treatments. His medical bag, discovered during courthouse renovations, contained hidden documents that he apparently couldn't bring himself to destroy, despite pressure from other conspirators. The territorial government's involvement in evidence destruction reached the highest levels. Governor Robert Reed's office systematically removed references to Blackwood Plantation from territorial correspondence and replaced them with vague mentions of plantation management issues. This high-level sanitization ensured that even territorial records contained no hint of the breeding program. Financial records proved more difficult to completely erase. Banking documents from Tallahassee show Blackwood's unusual payment patterns to slave traders and medical professionals, as well as his construction expenses for specialized buildings. While many records were destroyed, some survived in bank archives that weren't accessed during the immediate cover-up. The most systematic destruction involved architectural evidence. The breeding quarters were demolished immediately, but their foundations remained buried under hastily planted vegetation. Archaeological evidence discovered during courthouse renovations included building materials and structural remnants that confirmed the existence of the specialized facilities described in surviving documents. Educational institutions also participated in the evidence destruction. Florida Territorial Seminary removed Blackwood's name from donor lists and destroyed correspondence about his attempts to share his breeding techniques with agricultural programs. This institutional sanitization ensured that academic records contained no trace of his systematic human rights violations. The cover-up's effectiveness is demonstrated by the complete absence of the breeding program from contemporary historical accounts. Histories of Jefferson County, written in the 1840s and 1850s, make no mention of Blackwood Plantation's true activities, instead describing it as a typical cotton operation that ended in tragedy. This historical erasure lasted for over 180 years. Some evidence survived purely by accident: documents hidden in courthouse walls during renovations, papers sealed in medical bags, and letters never sent were preserved despite the systematic destruction efforts. The surviving fragments, discovered during 2019 renovations, provided the first comprehensive evidence of the breeding program's existence and the subsequent cover-up. Chapter 8. Buried Truth. For 180 years, the truth about Blackwood Plantation lay buried beneath layers of official silence, sanitized records, and collective amnesia, until a routine courthouse renovation in 2019 uncovered hidden documents that finally exposed the systematic horrors and coordinated cover-up that had been successfully hidden for nearly 2 centuries. The discovery began when construction workers renovating the Jefferson County Courthouse found a sealed compartment hidden within the building's original walls. Local historians initially assumed they had found routine historical documents, but the contents proved to be one of the most significant finds in American slavery research. The hidden cache contained over 200 documents related to Blackwood Plantation, including Blackwood's personal breeding ledgers, Elizabeth's unsent letters to her sister, Dr. Whitfield's medical bag with consultation notes, and Sheriff Caldwell's actual investigation notes before their official sanitization. These documents provided the first comprehensive evidence of the systematic breeding program. Dr. Sarah Chen, a historian at Florida State University, led the team analyzing the discovered documents. Her initial reaction was skepticism. The systematic nature of the breeding program seemed too extreme even for antebellum slavery. However, cross-referencing with contemporary sources and archaeological evidence confirmed the document's authenticity. The most disturbing discovery was Blackwood's Manual for Scientific Breeding, a 40-page document detailing his methods and intended for distribution to other planters. This manual provided insight into the systematic nature of the program and Blackwood's belief that his techniques could revolutionize slavery's profitability throughout the South. Elizabeth Blackwood's personal papers revealed the psychological torture inflicted on both enslaved people and slave-holding women. Her detailed descriptions of being forced to witness and administer the breeding program provided unprecedented insight into the complex trauma that affected everyone within the plantation's boundaries. Archaeological investigation of the former plantation site confirmed the document's descriptions. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the foundations of the demolished breeding quarters, positioned exactly as described in Blackwood's architectural plans. Excavation uncovered restraining devices, medical instruments, and other physical evidence of the breeding program. The discovery process revealed the sophisticated nature of the 1839 cover-up. Multiple documents showed evidence of coordination between officials, suggesting that the evidence destruction was planned and systematically executed rather than spontaneous. This level of organization indicated that contemporary authorities understood they were hiding significant crimes. Modern genealogical research has traced descendants of enslaved people from Blackwood Plantation, many of whom had family oral traditions about terrible things that happened to their ancestors in Florida. These oral histories, previously dismissed as exaggerated trauma narratives, were validated by the documentary evidence discovered in 2019. The revelation has forced historians to reconsider the extent of systematic breeding programs during American slavery. While informal breeding practices were known to occur, the Blackwood documents provide the most detailed evidence of systematic, scientifically planned breeding operations designed to maximize human reproductive exploitation. Legal scholars have used the Blackwood documents to examine the failure of legal systems to protect enslaved people from extreme violations. The correspondence between officials shows conscious decisions to prioritize property rights over human rights, even when violations exceeded contemporary standards of acceptable treatment. The psychological impact on modern readers mirrors the trauma experienced by contemporary witnesses. Dr. Jen's research team required counseling support while analyzing the documents, and several researchers had to step away from the project due to the emotional toll of examining systematic human rights violations. Religious institutions have been forced to confront their historical complicity in the cover-up. The Methodist Church in particular has acknowledged that their historical records were deliberately sanitized to hide evidence of pastoral failure to intervene in systematic sexual violence against enslaved people. The documents have also revealed the extent to which breeding programs influenced American economic development. Blackwood's correspondence with northern financiers shows that systematic human breeding was understood as an investment strategy that extended far beyond individual plantations. Educational institutions have had to revise their understanding of antebellum slavery's systematic nature. The Blackwood documents demonstrate that the extreme violations of human dignity were not aberrations, but part of calculated economic strategies designed to maximize profits from human reproduction. The discovery has prompted calls for additional archaeological investigation of plantation sites throughout the South. Historians now suspect that systematic breeding programs may have been more widespread than previously understood, hidden by similar cover-up efforts that successfully erased evidence for over a century. Chapter 9. Echoes Through Time. The legacy of Blackwood Plantation extends far beyond the boundaries of Jefferson County, revealing patterns of systematic exploitation, institutional complicity, and historical erasure that shaped American society for generations and continue to influence contemporary discussions about historical trauma and accountability. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Blackwood Plantation. We'll see you in the next video. The psychological trauma inflicted at Blackwood Plantation created generational wounds that persisted long after the plantation's violent end. Descendants of survivors carried family stories about ancestors who suffered unspeakable things in Florida, oral traditions that were dismissed by historians until the 2019 documentary evidence validated these painful memories. Contemporary research has revealed that several other plantations in Florida and neighboring states may have operated similar breeding programs during the 1830s. References in private correspondence and financial records suggest that Blackwood's system was not unique, but rather part of a broader network of systematic human breeding operations designed to maximize profits from enslaved reproduction. The cover-up's success demonstrates the power of institutional coordination in erasing historical evidence. The systematic destruction of records, dispersal of witnesses, and creation of alternative narratives created a template that was likely used to hide other extreme violations of human rights throughout the antebellum period. Modern trauma research has used the Blackwood documents to better understand the psychological impact of systematic sexual violence during slavery. The detailed accounts of both enslaved people and Elizabeth Blackwood provide unprecedented insight into how systematic breeding programs created complex trauma that affected entire communities. The economic implications of systematic breeding programs extended far beyond individual plantations. Blackwood's correspondence with northern investors reveals that human breeding was understood as a financial strategy that attracted capital investment and influenced market speculation in enslaved people as commodities. Legal scholars have pointed to the Blackwood case as evidence of how American legal systems consistently prioritized property rights over human rights. The systematic failure of courts, law enforcement, and government officials to intervene in extreme violations established precedents that influenced legal approaches to human rights for generations. The role of women in perpetuating and resisting slavery becomes more complex through Elizabeth Blackwood's story. Her forced complicity demonstrates how slaveholding women could be simultaneously perpetrators and victims, complicating traditional narratives about gender and power within slavery's system of exploitation. Religious institutions' failure to intervene at Blackwood Plantation reflects broader patterns of theological justification for extreme violations of human dignity. The systematic erasure of evidence from church records demonstrates how religious institutions actively participated in hiding crimes rather than confronting moral failures. Educational research has revealed how the sanitization of historical records influenced American education about slavery for over a century. The successful erasure of systematic breeding programs from historical accounts contributed to minimized understanding of slavery's systematic cruelty and its lasting impact on American society. Archaeological investigation of plantation sites has been revolutionized by the Blackwood discovery. Researchers now use ground-penetrating radar and other technologies to locate evidence of specialized buildings and systematic operations that were deliberately hidden from historical records. The psychological impact on modern researchers studying systematic breeding programs has led to development of new protocols for investigating historical trauma. The emotional toll of analyzing documents describing systematic sexual violence has required institutions to provide counseling support for historians working with these materials. Contemporary discussions about reparations have been informed by the Blackwood documents' revelation of systematic breeding programs' economic impact. The calculated exploitation of human reproduction for profit demonstrates the extent to which enslaved people were treated as capital investments rather than human beings. The global context of systematic human breeding has been illuminated by the Blackwood case. Comparative research has revealed similar operations in other slave-holding societies, suggesting that systematic reproductive exploitation was a worldwide feature of slavery rather than an American aberration. Family reunification efforts have been complicated by evidence of systematic breeding programs. DNA analysis of potential descendants must account for forced reproductive relationships that created biological connections without cultural or emotional family bonds, challenging traditional approaches to genealogical research. The Blackwood Plantation case stands as testimony to the power of historical truth to emerge despite systematic efforts at erasure. After 180 years of silence, the voices of those who suffered under Jonathan Blackwood's systematic cruelty have finally found expression, ensuring that their experiences contribute to humanity's understanding of both historical trauma and the resilience of those who survived it.